So the interviewer asked Bell Hooks, are you making any distinction between Thich Nhat Hanh's expression engage Buddhism and liberation theology? And Bell Hooks said, no, I like that the point of convergence of liberation theology, Islamic mysticism, and engage Buddhism is the sense of love that leads to commitment and involvement with the world, and not a turning away from the world. A form of wisdom that I strive for is the ability to know what is needed at a given moment in time. When do I need to reside in that location of stillness and contemplation? And when do I need to get up off my ass and do whatever is needed to be done in terms of physical work or engagement with others or confrontation with others? I'm not interested in ranking one type of action over the other. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Claire, who's going to introduce our speaker for tonight.
Hi, everyone. It's really great to see you all and some familiar faces. That's very exciting. Well, Moeena's presentation will speak for itself, but I've known Moeena for a long time. And even though she was young when I met her, she was already super socially engaged and really committed to working for various kinds of justice. She comes from a family that is for generations, from what I understand, been committed to public service. It's quite admirable. Moeena right now is working as the Chief Operating Officer at the National Organization on Disability. And before that, she was in the New York City Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs, where she was the leader of the office's Immigration Legal Services program. She's also worked in international environmental conservation, global health, and youth education in India. She graduated from Wellesley College and has a master's degree in public administration from NYU. And she's originally from India, and she lives in Brooklyn, and she is deaf. And so, Moeena, we're really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Claire. And thank you to you and Annie, Adriana, and Rachel for the invitation to talk today. And it's so nice to be with everyone. And I hope everyone's had a good day. As Claire mentioned, my name is Moeena Das. And before I start, I would like to briefly describe myself. I am an Indian woman with brown skin, brown eyes, black hair, the shoulder-length black hair that is half up, half down. I'm wearing a navy blue top, and to my background is a black and white wall with a plant in the corner. And as we progress through our time today, I am going to be describing some of what I talk about, because I will be at various points referencing slides. And for anybody who could benefit from an audio description, I will be describing what's on the screen. So thank you again for having me here. I really would love to use our time today and to talk about disability. And I know that this is the third in the Disability Justice series, and you've had the opportunity to hear so far from Caitlin Hatch and from Dara Baldwin, and really look forward to using today's session to build on some of the concepts and themes that they shared, and also to share a slightly different perspective. So with that, I am going to very quickly screen share. And even though we've been in Zoom land for 2 years now almost, I'm going to continue to ask the question and just make sure that folks can see what's up on the screen. So if folks can just give me a quick thumbs up, that would be very helpful, just to make sure that this is up and running. Okay, perfect. So why disability matters. As I start, so the session goals for today, I would love for you to leave our time together with an understanding of how common the disabled experience is, an awareness of why language matters, and then just a reflection on your own experience with disability. And I will say that much of what I share today by the way of context and certain facts and figures will be US focused, but there will be certain pieces that of course have a broader application to the experience with disability, regardless of where you are and where you may be in the world. Since we're a small group today, I'd love to get some thoughts from you and I have some questions for those of you on the call today. So the first is, what do you hope to learn as you think about disability and think about what you know? What would you like to learn? If you can just chat in the box and just put in a few words, please just share with me what's on your mind and what you're looking to get out of this time. Don't be shy. How to use respectful, thoughtful language that conveys welcome and inclusion. Gain insight on how to talk about disability to people who aren't disabled. Thank you. I want to broaden my understanding of disabilities, a better understanding of the lived experience of disability, the experience of being disabled and how to be more aware and sensitive to different abilities, a deeper understanding of the experience of disability, and to gain an understanding of how disabilities can affect one's experience in different situations. And then the last two are, I want to learn how people in the disability justice movement show respect and compassion through actions and language, and how disability injustice can show up in interpersonal interactions and how to remedy that. Thank you. Appreciate that. And I think that through our time today, my hope would be to touch on much of what has been shared here. I will, of course, caveat this with I myself, even though I am disabled, I am deaf, I'm still learning every single day. And I'm also unlearning. And I'll speak a little bit more about what I mean by unlearning as we go through our time together today. But I do hope that much of what has been touched on here will be reflected in what you hear and what we have a chance to discuss over the course of the next hour or so. The second question for folks on this call are, what do you think of when you think of disability? And I don't want you to think too hard, just immediately, instinctively, what are the first things that come to your mind when you think of the word disability? Having different accessibility needs, having barriers to access, how people with hearing can support deaf people in everyday life and activities, including online, in addition to the camera being on. It's changing, but usually I think of obvious physical impairments, though I know that's not adequate. Physical or mental differences that can make situations more difficult to the individual affected. Physical impairment, stigmatization, and physical disabilities, things I can see, although I know that's not the reality. Thank you. And the final one I see here is learning to think about disability justice and not only disability rights. Thank you. What I will say before I start is you've heard in the framework of the conversation from Caitlin and the conversation from Dara, there's been a really wonderful evolution of their perspectives, their thoughts, really understanding the difference between disability justice, disability rights, and also thinking about how disability justice and access needs can really play out in one's interpersonal and one's day-to-day interactions. The lens that I'm really going to be taking today is to be building on that and also offering a little bit more of the context that helps us all further think about the experience of disability in our day-to-day in all contexts that we all operate in. And also to really think about how we individually, at a personal level, really identify with and engage with disability. And just a little bit about me before I start. I am deaf, and my relationship with disability, and particularly disability as an identity, though, is a very recent one. It's only really been in the last 5 to 7 years that I've owned and I have accepted and have embraced my identity as somebody who's foremost somebody who is disabled, and more secondarily, somebody who is deaf. And the reason is, for me at least, I'm thinking about my journey and how my identity has evolved. But for much of my life, I've always had the experience of really being the only, right? The only person who was deaf in the room. That certainly was the experience. And frankly, even today, in much of my day-to-day interactions, personally, professionally, I remain one of the few individuals who was deaf. But even thinking about my experience, not only growing up and being certainly through childhood and being the only child, family member, friend who was deaf, there's also has been other identities that for me personally have come into play with how I've interacted with and have experienced with my deaf identity and my disabled identity. I moved to the United States when I was 12 and moved into spaces that were by and large, largely white spaces, spaces where even though I was mainstreamed in the academic settings, and mainstreamed would be ones for those who aren't familiar with the term, that would be where disabled and non-disabled students are taught in the same classroom setting. Even though I was mainstreamed, I was, again, often the only student with a disability that was openly, at the time, identified or openly had a disability. Now, I think that if we were to look at the classroom environments or look at what students identified as, that identity likely is one that folks might be more open with, whether it's a learning disability, whether it's a cognitive disability, or a whole host of other disabilities. But at the time, for me, it felt very much that it was sort of me, certainly in the school setting and certainly in social settings, very much by myself and on my own. And then you add the other layer, you've got the factor of assimilating to life in the United States, assimilating to life again in spaces where I was also in the minority, where it came to race, where it came into country of origin. There were choices that were made, both conscious and subconscious, around which identity was I going to navigate and advocate for the most. And I say all of this as somebody who has the tremendous privilege of somebody who can pass for being non-disabled. If I hadn't shared with anyone on this call that I'm deaf, if I hadn't been open as I am about the fact that I'm deaf, you might hear me and listen to me and say, I can't quite place her accent, because I do have an accent that's a combination of what I call deaf Indian American accent that can be quite hard to place. But beyond that, you wouldn't really know that I'm deaf. And yet, as navigating the school settings, navigating whether secondary school, undergraduate, and then professionally, you absolutely could tell that I was somebody who identified as a woman. You absolutely could tell that I was somebody who identified or who is not white. And so certainly in those contexts and in those environments, in terms of what identity were folks going to look at and try to navigate? For me, it was always, you know what? Yes, advocate for what you need in the context of what you need to be successful, quote unquote, in terms of informing my teachers, informing direct managers in the workplace that I'm deaf and folks need to, for example, lip read, face me so I can lip read. Beyond that, though, I didn't really push it. And when I think about my academic context, certainly in the undergraduate years and my professional years, I never really pushed, for example, on accommodations that I needed to facilitate full access until very recently. I went through a good several years of my working life where I did not once request a single accommodation. The extent to which I ever requested an accommodation was in the context of informing recruiters anytime I was at the interview stage, and then in the context of informing my manager, so they were aware, and that's it. The first step I took, which is why I come to this 5 to 7 year time frame, which for me was this moment where I started to own, I think, my identity as somebody who is disabled more so, was when I formally decided to make the choice to request accommodations at a more recent place of work, which is that I needed, in certain contexts, access to real-time captioning. So very much what you're seeing on the call today with access to real-time closed captioning, that is effectively what I asked for and what I needed. And there was a particular workplace that ask was made and was effectively not granted, despite advocating, despite the existence of the laws, despite going through as many channels as possibly needed. Just that process of finally making the choice to ask for it and then getting to a point where that really wasn't received and wasn't granted, was in many ways also a turning point for me to really look at my own identity and really decide what mattered and what did I care about. And so here I am today, very much proudly owning my identity as somebody who's disabled, proudly owning my identity as somebody who's deaf. And in my current work at the National Organization on Disability, we are a national nonprofit organization, and our focus is on increasing the workforce participation of people with disabilities across the United States. And I didn't have any background in formally in workforce and disability inclusion, but certainly when it comes to what employers and workplaces can be doing better to make their workplaces more inclusive for people with disabilities. And then on the flip side, what is an employee or an individual with a disability going through to navigate their workplace environment, were certainly things that I had personal experiences with. And so have been now at NOD for 2.5 years, and our sole work is working with employers to change their practices, to change their policies, to change their behaviors so that their workplaces are more inclusive. So today, with that context today, what I'd really like to spend time on is talking about, as I said, just thinking back to the original session goals, just sharing how common the experience of disability is. When I think back to my own experience of feeling isolated, feeling like there really weren't many others around me who were like me, who had similar experiences like me, thinking about just how much language has mattered. I say this personally all the time, that words matter and language matters. And for me, I do believe that a lot of that has stemmed from my own experience of just how insidious just casual words and casual phrases that can be so harmful actually can play out for an individual level. And then just reflecting, allowing each of you to reflect on your own experience with disability. Let's start by talking first about the models of disability. And this builds a little bit for those who had the opportunity to hear Caitlin and Dara share their presentations and their thoughts. This builds a little bit on what they've discussed. So we really started in terms of model of disability in the charity model. The charity model is one that effectively says that and views people with disability as objects of charity, of pity, This is very much considered an outdated model of disability, but I would love for all of you to just keep that thought of pity and charity, though, in the back of your mind, because that's going to be very important when we start talking about ableism and language. There's the medical model of disability, which is very much focused on one where people with disabilities are ones who need to be treated, those who are sick, who need curing, who need fixing, and that medical intervention is the main way to go about doing so. And under this model, this was very much one that focused on, and to an extent, this is still very much, despite our evolution to the social and human rights model, which I'll speak about in just a second, that is still very much how our day-to-day continues to be grounded and continues to be shaped, which is that focus on medical professionals, the focus on doctors and nurses and other medical practitioners as sometimes setting the answers or really establishing what the answers are when it comes to the experience of those with disabilities in society today. And now we really have evolved in terms of the dialogue, in terms of the conversation to the social human rights model. And then I think the next model to that I would add would be true disability justice to that. But the ultimate aim of the social and human rights model is it's really grounded in the human rights paradigm, which emphasizes the fact that disability as an experience and obstacles and barriers stem from the fact that as a society is structured and built for non-disabled individuals, and the systems are upheld by non-disabled individuals. So if I take my own experience, for instance, I'm deaf, but 9 out of 10 times, any of the obstacles or barriers that I run into in my day-to-day don't stem from the fact that I am deaf, but it really stems from what is it that I have to navigate every single day to be able to fully engage and to be able to fully participate, which really have nothing to do with my deafness, but everything to do with the structures and with the systems around me. Thinking about the definitions of disability in the US, and this is again acknowledging a very US-centric model and how disability is defined. So the ADA does have a 3-pronged definition of disability, and the 3 prongs are as follows. It is a physical or mental, and I want to pause for a second and say impairment is a word that's in ADA language. It's the legal language. It is not a word that I use in my day-to-day. It is not a word I like to use. I'm simply sharing what the legal definition is. So the physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities of an individual. It can be something that whether you've had a record of such an impairment, so it may not be existing today, but perhaps you had had it prior, and then being regarded as having such an impairment. So effectively what this means is that you might have, as an individual, certain activities, and we'll talk about this in just a second, but you might have certain impairments that limit your day-to-day. You might have had previously a record, whether it's that perhaps you had cancer, perhaps you had a heart attack, and perhaps you previously had complications from a pregnancy. That would all be something where you would have a record of having had such an impairment that limited your life activity, but doesn't exist today, but that record still protects you under the ADA. And then the final would be the perception. And this is the closest where it comes to really incorporating the more civil rights aspect into the actual legal definition of the ADA. But that is really what protects any individual and gives them rights under the ADA against any perception of being essentially treated adversely because of any regarded as having such an impairment. The term major life activities is one that folks often don't quite, it can be a little confusing, and is one that I think is important to spend a bit of time on. Major life activities can include, but are not always limited to, things like walking, things like sitting, cheering, breathing, lifting items, or taking care of oneself. And I think that taking care of oneself is especially important to consider because that's also a fairly broad definition because it can include taking care of yourself in all aspects of what it means to take care of yourself. This further extends when we think about actual types of disabilities. And again, really important to me that we are spending time thinking about and understanding definitions of disability. Because if you go back to what I started with in terms of the 3 models of disability, starting with that charity model, and then also thinking about the medical model of disability, our language, the way that we understand disability as a society, the way that we think about disability as a society is still very much rooted in a combination of the charity model and of the medical model. So people with disabilities as individuals who would ones who need to be helped, right? Or individuals with disabilities who might need to be treated. So really effectively othering those who are disabled. When in reality, the definition is so broad, and it includes cognitive disabilities, it includes sensory, physical, mental health disabilities, and there's a wide range and a very long list of possible types of disabilities within each of those categories. And I have some resources at the end of this presentation where you can go to familiarize yourself with just the wide range of disabilities. But the point that's incredibly important here is that not all disabilities are visible. So we have this spectrum in the definition of disability, and not all of them are visible. I'm curious, just if folks can chat just a few individuals, what percent of disabilities do you think are visible? Just any number, please share whatever comes to your mind. %, 30%, 30%, 25%, 15%. All right, thank you. So the answer is that at least 75%, the likely, and the number has been shifting in terms of how the data is cut, but at least 75% of all disabilities are invisible. And the real numbers that folks are increasingly starting to think it is closer to 90%. And so what this effectively means is that most disabilities are non-visible, so you can't see them. My disability, I've said I'm deaf, is considered an invisible disability. There are so many other disabilities. It can include, again, the full spectrum, and there might even be physical disabilities that can be invisible. So for example, somebody who might be low vision will have a visual disability. You may not always know. Somebody who may have a particular cognitive disability. So think about so many things such as chronic fatigue syndrome. Most recently, one invisible disability, and could also be visible, but has by and large been invisible, that many of us have been living and experiencing either individually or through others in our lives is long-haul COVID. That's an example of a disability that could be very well invisible. And then you have learning disabilities, you have mental health disabilities, there's just such a wide range of different types of disabilities. But the point here that I really want and each of us to sit with and to think about and reflect on, that we really cannot see most disabilities. And that by and large, they will be invisible to you. And when we talk about identity as well, and when we talk about how individuals interact with disability, including those who may be disabled, it might be the identity first that you're really experiencing and that you're associating with, and you will identify less with the disabled experience. So I do strongly encourage, and if we have time at the end, I'd be happy to go through that longer list of the different types of disability that could fit within these different buckets, because it is a tremendously extensive list. And I will say that before the pandemic, the type of disability that was growing the fastest were mental health disabilities. And that is absolutely a number that's been increasing even more so as a result of what we've collectively been experiencing as a globe in the last 2 years. And certainly now we have another completely new category of disabilities, which is long haul COVID, that at least in the United States now is considered a disability and is affecting up to 1.3 million Americans. And that's an undercount at the latest estimates of individuals that have been affected by long haul COVID. So really reflecting on the fact that we really can't see most disabilities is just an important takeaway that if you honestly take nothing else away, I would just really love for you to stick with that. Some other numbers that are important to think about, and I'm going to be sharing these numbers in the hopes that this broadens even more so for many folks in this conversation, just that awareness and that perspective of how common the experience with disability is for each and every one of us. There are 1 billion people with disabilities globally. 83% of disabilities are acquired after the age of 18. So if one has not had an experience with disability yet, you most likely will at some point in the course of your life. At least 74% are invisible, and that number is likely closer to 90%, and this is globally. In the United States, there are 61 million people with disabilities, so at least 1 in 4 Americans. And again, this is a figure that I'm personally excited to see latest numbers as we close out 2021, because again, COVID and the pandemic has likely increased that figure higher. We just don't know. We need to see what that actually looks like over the next couple of months. At least 2 in 5 adults over the age of 65 have a disability. This is also important because, again, when we think about what our impressions are of disability, what our thoughts might be in terms of our understanding of disability previously, for many folks might think of disability as something that would affect certain age ranges or certain categories of individuals, but it's only 2 in 5 individuals who are 65 or older who are disabled. So there's a significant population of those who are disabled who are under that age range. 1 in 4 women have a disability. When we start thinking about race and ethnicity, and again, shifting that focus and shifting that awareness of disability from a monolith of there's just this category of individuals who are disabled, sort of shifting that thinking from othering individuals with disabilities to really understand what are the ways in which a disabled identity and a disabled experience can interact with other identities that individuals can experience. And I do think that really understanding the latest race and ethnicity numbers in the US, this is for adults, is important. 3 in 10 Indigenous Americans are disabled. 1 in 4 Black Americans are disabled. 1 in 6 Latinx Americans, 1 in 10 Asian Americans, 1 in 5 White Americans. So this is certainly something that experiences certain racial demographics more so than others, but it is an experience that really cuts across a wide range of races and ethnicities. In addition, rather than just being this, again, a monolith of this is the disabled community and this is the disabled population, it really is very much part of all of us and our other identities as well. Poverty and employment, just would love to share some statistics there too, just to ground the understanding further. So the poverty rate of people with disabilities as of the end of 2019 was 25.9% as compared to 11.4% of those without disabilities. And then the workforce participation rate of people with disabilities is 36.8% as compared to 76.6% of those without disabilities. And I will say that this workforce participation rate of people with disabilities is a number that hasn't budged much since World War II. It's really hovered at about 27 to 36.8, which is really the highest that it's been since the 1940s, really hasn't budged much in that intervening period. And so certainly when we talk about the people with disabilities and as compared to those who are non-disabled, there absolutely are gaps that we can see when it comes to poverty, when it comes to workforce participation, and then certainly also education, which I didn't include here, but would be happy to talk about if timing permits at the end of our conversation today. And now let's talk a little bit more, and I'm about ableism and language and just interacting on a day-to-day. I have noted on this slide a series of statements and questions that I have personally received at varying points over the course of my life, and some of these very recently. And the title of this slide is Ableism and What Not to Say. This is just a sampling. And I'm going to go through these and just offer a bit of commentary as to why these are so, personally have felt really challenging, very egregious, can be very harmful, and also the casualness with which these questions and these statements have been made. Oftentimes, I know for my work every day, I will have a lot of meetings, I interact with folks outside my organization quite often, and oftentimes I will introduce myself, especially for those that I've never met before, and say, hi, my name is Moeena. Before we start, I just want you to know that I'm deaf and I have access to captioning because usually I now control the Zoom invitation. And so I can make sure that there's captions so I don't have to go through that back and forth. But I will say at the start of the conversation, I am deaf, and particularly if the folks are on video, to thank them for that and basically say, this is appreciated because I do rely also on a combination of access to captions and lip reading. That's very much my experience. That's my accessibility need. 5 out of 10 times, the default response is, I'm so sorry. And it's like, sorry for what, right? Or really, most times where I've told folks, I'm deaf, the response is, I am so sorry. And that's why I wanted you all to hold on to the charity model of disability, because that stigma of disability is something that is to be either pitied, or individuals who need assistance, or disability as a bad word, or disability as an experience that's not one that you identify with. That is, and then in addition to the medical model of disability, is something to be treated and something that requires fixing. That all really hasn't shifted much when it comes to our collective understanding of disability, such that that is the most common response that I have received. And others I know who are disabled of different types of disabilities have received one openly disclosing and sharing the fact that they do have whatever the disability is that they may have. Often I have gotten the question of, why are you deaf? How did you become deaf? When did you become deaf? And I should say that I actually have a very complicated relationship with this particular question, because for a long time, I used to answer it. And at this point, I don't need to answer it. I owe nobody, and no person with any kind of a disability owes anybody an explanation of why they're disabled, how they became disabled, what's the reason they're disabled. And yes, that was a question that for a long time, individuals had a tremendous fascination with. It's like, when were you diagnosed as being deaf? Or how did you become deaf? Why are you deaf? What assistive devices do you use? And I would answer it because at the time it was something that I took as interest in me, when at the end of the day, interest in me should not have to be interest in and ultimately a justification of my explaining to you why I am entitled to calling myself or identifying myself as either being disabled or as being deaf or both. And this is also something that, just from conversations with other individuals who are openly identify as being disabled, is something that they have also very much experienced. And again, that is a very casual question that folks just ask without even thinking. But you're not really disabled, or you don't really have X disability. This, again, if we think back to visible versus invisible, we have been so conditioned that in order for disability to be true, or one disabled identity to be true, you have to see it to believe it. And, or if somebody says, I am disabled, whatever that disability may be, to potentially challenge that, or to go back to the second question of, wait, but tell me more. That absolutely should never be the case. If somebody says that they're disabled, you take that at face value and you just accept that and you thank them for sharing and move on. Rather than that justification, I don't believe it. I can't really see it. And I've also had many instances, and this is a combination of the first and the third statement of, oh, I forgot, could you talk, right? So because I don't offer any cues to remind the other individual that I am actually completely deaf, even though I rely on lip reading and I have an assistive device that allows me to get enough auditory stimulation and awareness to follow conversations, there still is the how, but are you really? And that is also something that for many other individuals who identify as many other disabilities, they've also experienced. There is then the, I could never do what you've done, or what you do every single day because of your disability. And that, again, thinking back to the charity model of disability, and then thinking back to the medical model of disability is very much rooted in this, what's supposed to be, or comes across from the other individual's perspective as them thinking that they are speaking from a place of goodwill or good intent, and perhaps they are. It really comes across on the other end as something of, well, but it's, what does that mean? What does it mean that you could never do what had been done? Because as far as I'm concerned, speaking for myself, this is part of my day-to-day. It's part of who I am and how I am. And then similarly, it's about overcoming, thinking back to the medical model of disability, right? Treating the disability, fixing it. So the whole idea that one's disability has to be overcome, it has to be something that you compensate for, something that you do so well, because again, the bar is actually quite low. We're thinking back to the charity model. The bar can be quite low for many people with disabilities of, I just can't believe that you've done that. Like, that's just so inspiring and so amazing. And from my perspective, it's my life, right? Like, this is who I am, this is how I am. And I'd much rather you be impressed with that my professional achievements and skill that I have, rather than from my vantage point and for many others who might be disabled, just what seems to be interpreted as literally for existing. So those are just a few, and this is just a sampling of the most common ones that I've experienced, and I know others have experienced when it comes to reactions to our disability, engaging with our disability, and ones that truly can be just incredibly harmful and isolating and very frustrating to navigate. Similarly, and this is quite similar on this slide, I have a little bit more on what not to say. And I know that Dara had a similar slide in their presentation. And I'm not going to go into each and every one of these, other than to say, for starters, ask. There is a, in the US, in the EU, Canada, and Australia, there is a growing movement towards individuals who prefer identity first language, but the safe thing to do would be to start with people first or person first language, but always ask. Again, this is something that I have personally, for example, evolved in my own thinking and my own use, both in my own identity as well as those around me. But it's a little, from speaking for myself, right? A person who is deaf, I'm deaf, right? I'm not a person who is deaf, I just am deaf. And similarly, others who identify with other disabilities would much prefer to be identified with what their identity is rather than being a person who is. So the way that I look at it from my vantage is, you wouldn't say, I'm a person who is Indian, I'm Indian, right? Or a person who identifies as a woman, I identify as a woman. And so just really taking that person out of the equation. But that, again, can be very cultural, and it can be something that you do tend to see a lot more in certain parts of the world. So the safest thing always to do is to ask. That said, there absolutely are certain words and certain phrases that just shouldn't be used or should never be said. The R word absolutely should never be used. Handicapped is one that I know that in the US, you still will, even just go into a parking lot, you will still see parking spots that you have the word handicapped on them, but that is really not a word that's should be used in common language at all when referencing disability or discussing disability. Others that can be particularly challenging is the notion of being afflicted with a particular disability or being bound to a wheelchair or bound to your bed. Like, that is absolutely not the framing or the phrasing that should be used. In fact, if you talk to many individuals who use different types of mobility devices, they consider those devices to be very much a part of their own physical self. And it is incredibly offensive and incredibly harmful to be using phrasing such as some of the ones that you see here. And then similarly, I strongly encourage and strongly recommend, if you don't know Lydia X.C. Brown, you should look up Lydia X.C. Brown. They have a really wonderful list of ableist words and ableist phrases that are by themselves ableist, but then they also have a really nice list of words and phrases that in particular contexts can be construed as ableist. And just to pause and be clear, when I'm talking about ableism, I'm talking about words, I'm talking about phrases, and I'm talking about behaviors that effectively are ones that diminish, that minimize, and are harmful to those who are disabled. So a few other phrases that are ones that are very common in our day-to-day. And the first two that I'm about to share are ones that are not only used very commonly in just day-to-day, but if you pick up any newspaper or log into any major news outlet, that is actually one that I've seen a huge surge just in journalists and reporters just writing out those phrases to describe various contexts, especially when talking about COVID and the pandemic in different ways. Tone deaf, turn a blind eye to. One that is a series, and I bucketed them together because these all tie to mental health disabilities and tie to language that can be especially harmful and isolating to those who identify with mental health disabilities. Crazy. I think that's probably one that all individuals have used at various times to describe their day or to describe a particular experience in their life. Crazy, nuts, bonkers, loony, moron, those are all things that casual conversation, media representation, even written language, we'll find that so often, but can really, really be incredibly difficult when that language is used so commonly. And then when you think about, we haven't really spoken much about stigma, but when you think about stigma against disability and just that's particularly mental health disabilities, when we think about just how common some of these ableist words and phrases, especially in the context of mental health, it matters. It really does. Dumb, stupid, lame, and then of course any iteration of any word that ends in TARD, and there's many in casual language that one can identify and one can point to that can that at least have ties back to the R word that really should be eliminated from vocabulary as a baseline. Like if there's one word that definitely gets eliminated, it should be that one, but absolutely the others matter very much too. So I'm going to pause there and stop and I'm mindful of the time. I know I went a little bit over, but I hope that has offered just a little bit more context as we reflect on the frameworks that Caitlin offered, the frameworks that Dara offered, and just really thinking about our collective lived experience when it comes to disability and how language matters. And just that reminder that we all, if we haven't already, we all have or likely will be interacting with disability at some point in our lives, personally or through those most closely around us. So with that, I will turn it back over to you, Annie and Claire.
Thank you so much, Moeena. That was great. And now we have a chance to ask questions. We have a couple, I think, already in the chat, and I'm just going to go back to AD had something interested in views on intersections between people with spectrum of severity of chronic pain and people with disabilities. I don't know if that's clear, or AD, if you want to clarify that, what your question is exactly. Did you want to say more about it? Let me just see. All right, we can, what do you think, Moeena? Does that make sense to you, that question?
Sorry, Annie, just to confirm, this is the question on views of the intersection between people with the spectrum of severity of chronic pain and people with disability as time fits. I would love further clarity in the question as well. The only comment I would just make, and this goes back to my point about first my own experience with just my disabled identity, but then also to inquire and to ask. There certainly are certain individuals who might identify as having a chronic illness, and that might be their first and primary identity. They may not yet identify with being disabled as well. And so I don't know if that quite answers the question there, but I do think that there can be a relationship between where particular individuals can be in their own journey in identifying with a chronic illness, and then how they perceive that as identifying as a whole to the disabled experience.
Well, that actually, if I can, I'll just say that was a question that was sort of on my mind too, is that, you know, if you look at the ADA criteria, I mean, so many people could fall into that criteria. And how would that be seen if, like, you know, people, like if everybody was like, well, I have this issue or I had this issue, and I, you know, like, is that too much? I mean, I don't know. That's sort of my question. I think it's sort of related to this one.
Yeah, no, I think it's an important one. And certainly there's such a wide range of disabilities. And you will absolutely have certain individuals who identify with their identity first. And again, if you take my own experience, right? For me, my primary identity for a long time was as somebody who was deaf. It was not as somebody who's disabled. I personally, as I have learned, and also that was the unlearning that I was referencing, I've unlearned what's also been my own internalized ableism. Even though I am somebody with a disability, you do internalize some of the ableist language and some of the ableist thinking. Adopting and owning the disabled identity was also myself a bit of reclaiming the power, if you will, or reclaiming my space as somebody who is navigating a world that is 9 out of 10 times any of the barriers that I face is because of the way that the world around me is designed. But that has also been very much a personal evolution, a personal study and a personal introspection. But I do firmly believe that if we are going to shift as a community, and this is speaking the disability community, but also as a society, it's going to be incumbent upon all of us to build that familiarity and build that understanding with just what disability means, and to ground ourselves in just the commonality of the experience. And we do have a ways to go there. And the disability movement, the disability rights movement and community, we're still very young in the grand scheme, also when we think about a lot of other movements that might exist too. So I do think some of this is also reflective of just where we are in a collective understanding of disability. Looking at some of the other questions. So a suggestion to someone who says things that feel like ableism, they criticize and judge and say things that would never happen to me. I can empathize with that. That's absolutely something that, just thinking back to some of those, you know, just the 5 statements and questions that I shared, that are the most common. Oftentimes now, my response is really, and this is my personal take, and this is my personal approach, is, if somebody is not comfortable or familiar or really understands the disabled experience, I've really started going to the numbers. And oftentimes for me, what has really bridged the gap with people who perhaps they're not as comfortable, or they will say things that are hurtful to me, but I do want to bridge the gap and bridge the dialogue, I'll start citing some of those statistics, because oftentimes that's really what makes folks pause and say, oh, wow, I didn't realize. And then I use that as an opportunity to engage in a further conversation. The R word, I can't even say it. I personally cannot even say the word. I ideally wouldn't even have it up on a slide if I can't help it. It just, unfortunately, is still a word that is still used in language. And so it is one that I have over time have sort of grudgingly put up just in text only, but I look very much forward to the day where it's not even up there. That's a really interesting question, and this is in response to the question, does brainstorm belittle people with disabilities? I am not sure. I can absolutely see how that would be uncomfortable, and I would just say that if it is, then I would think of an alternative option for that. And by no means is the list of certain words and phrases now supposed to make all of us be completely, nervous about every single word, but there just are some that are far more common than others that really just shouldn't be used in day-to-day. That's much more common than we would expect. But that's a really good question, and I will have to think about that a little bit more myself, and also ask some colleagues and friends what their perspectives are. So the next question is on sensory processing disorders and how those are viewed from a disability perspective. Absolutely. So if we think about, again, the spectrum of disabilities, it is a category of its own when it comes to disability, and very much, so some of the same principles that I mentioned and same concepts I mentioned are ones that would apply to individuals with sensory disabilities. And I will say that, just speaking again can't speak for, but in conversations with friends and colleagues who identify as having a sensory disability, the identity first language has been very much one that has really, I've looked to that community and my friends and colleagues that have really helped me better understand and better get comfortable my own self with identity first. And they've really been, at least for me personally, real leaders and advocates and really how to think about identity first language. When I share that I'm deaf, what ways would I like others to respond to me? And in general, when people share what their disabilities are, I think that's perfect. I think the best response is just to say, thank you so much for sharing. Like, what can I do to support you? What do you need? Like, what are your access needs? I think that that's the simplest way to respond. And I myself do that. I oftentimes in my work, particularly because of the work that I do, I will engage with partners, I will engage with colleagues that I've never met before, but will disclose that they have a particular disability. And my response will be, I appreciate you sharing. Thanks so much. Is there anything that we can do for that meeting to make sure that your access needs are met? That's a great question. So, and this is why I, share that some of the language that I am using and some of the context that I am using can be very US centric versus ones that might be comfortable or not comfortable, but ones that just might be common in other parts of the world. But the R word has really historically, and I am not an expert on the R word, so I'm going to give my general understanding of this. And then I think what I'd love to do afterwards is also just make sure that I can follow up with a couple of resources from those who are more experts in the topic. But to summarize, effectively, the R word is really a word that was used in a very derogatory, harmful way to describe and talk about people with intellectual disabilities in particular. It is a word that has really been fairly common in, at least in the language as I understand it, in the United States, in parts of, across the, I believe it was 70s, 80s, and then suddenly it is part of the fabric and part of our dialogue even today. But was very much used in a way that mocked, that belittled, and that really just made fun of and was harmful to particularly those with intellectual disabilities, and then was used really as a proxy for other types of disabilities, again, as a way to belittle and to harm. And I can certainly follow up and just make sure that Annie and Adriana and Claire just have a few other resources of others who've written at length on just the significance and a little bit more on the history of the R word.
Can I add, just as somebody who grew up in the 60s and 70s, well, I was born in the 60s, grew up in the 70s, that word really became proxy for disability in a way. It was like it was like a swear word, like a word to use to insult people with all kinds of disabilities. So just as context.
Yeah, I also wanted to point out that I don't really understand why people sort of argue with people who identify as disabled, and they say they have or are living with this condition or situations, part of them. And people try to say, well, you know, a lot of old people have that, so you're not really disabled. I mean, where do you think that tendency to argue comes from? Fear?
I think some of it is lack of awareness. So some of it is just really the stigma against disability. Some of it is, I do go back to the charity model and to the medical model. So again, disability is something that is to be pitied. Disability is something to be cured. And when you combine those two together, and the fact that we haven't really evolved, even though the framework and ultimately what we're aiming for is disability justice, is really moving more towards the human rights model of disability. Our language, our behavior, the way that a lot of the day-to-day is structured, and is still very much structured in a way that's just very much built for and upholds the lives and day-to-day of those who are non-disabled. And so I do think that when you don't have examples of different types of disability around you, when you don't have that awareness of just how common the disabled experience is, and you're still rooted in the idea of disability as charity or disability as something to be cured, I think it's just, it's socialized folks to give more license to challenge and to question and to say, but that can't actually be true, particularly if one's representation or understanding of disability might be very specific examples of those who have visible physical disabilities, which we know is just such a small percentage of the totality of the disabled experience. That's just my perspective on why that may be.
Thanks.
Other questions, other thoughts? Folks can also feel free to take themselves off mute if you like and verbalize your questions too. I'd love that.
I have one question. Thank you for answering my first question. My one question is, do you think that in people of color communities that there is more stigma regarding disability? I mean, that was my perception, and growing up in the Black community. I'm just wondering what your take is on that.
Absolutely, there is very much so, and again, I have other colleagues in the other organizations that are far better experts and really do the work around this. But yes, absolutely, and you know, again, just thinking about my own experience with disability, when you are, but also somebody who is a person of color, particularly in the U.S. context. You're continuously navigating those multiple identities, and if race and the experience that others may have with you and about you are really tied to the identities that they can see. And at least for me, it's gender identity, and it would be my racial identity. You will do what you can to really try to diminish or to try to ignore the other identities as well. And so I absolutely do think that that's true. And it is very much something that just in conversations with colleagues and other partner organizations, and I'd be happy again to follow up with Annie, Rachel, Claire, and Adriana with a few other resources of some other organizations that are focused on disability justice, are focused on disability inclusion, but are really trying to do work to change attitudes and change behavior among different communities of color, but certainly among the Black community in the United States. Lisa, just to clarify, the why is that in response to my comment about there being more stigma among communities of color? Okay, perfect. So,
yes.
okay, wonderful. So I'd be more than happy to just as a follow-up on this call, just share those additional resources that I'm thinking of with Annie and Claire to pass on perhaps as a follow-up. I also will share the PowerPoint presentation so that folks on this call have access to those. So I'll make note to share a couple of readings that I think could be really useful there. And then in response to the question on how to encourage and welcome people to disclose disabilities and make requests to meet accessibility needs, I'm smiling when I'm reading that question because that's actually something that in my day-to-day, in my current work, in the context of employment, I think about all the time, and it's something that I engage with the partners, and at my work, we work largely with employers, large employers, mostly based in the United States, but some who also have a global reach. And two of the things that come up continuously is one, how do you encourage more existing employees with disabilities to disclose? And then as employers are hiring and bringing new individuals on board into their workplaces, how do they create the right conditions so that candidates disclose their disability, both as part of the hiring process, but then also once they actually join? And then similarly, how do you create the right conditions for folks to meet and fulfill what their accessibility needs are? And a few things. A lot of this comes down to trust, psychological safety in the workplace, but also just in any environment that you may be personally or professionally. And with that comes that foundational understanding. I look forward personally to the day where I don't have to do, I call it a disability awareness, right? Or disability 101. I personally look forward to that day where there is no need to have a conversation or to have a dialogue with others around me, just even making the case or even making, just raising that understanding so that folks are all operating off of that base foundation, which oftentimes that base foundation is missing. And so when that base foundation is missing, we go back to a lot of what we've discussed here today, which is the stigma, the misconceptions, the stereotypes, the ableist language. And so oftentimes a lot of what we will do is, and I think that just going to your question on what does it take to encourage people with disabilities, just really creating the right community where at least at a community level, there is that shared understanding. And that's obviously harder to do in larger scale communities, but among smaller families, among social circles, it might be possible to just really build that trust and to really build that foundational awareness. And I think in terms of meeting accessibility needs, that is also one that is very much, in my view, again, ties back to the foundational awareness and that foundational understanding, but it also ties to what are the larger structures and what are the larger systems around you, which is a fairly abstract thing to say, but effectively what I mean by that is, if you even just think about my day-to-day today, and I'm using myself as an example here, in the last 18, almost 24 months, I have been, as many of us have been, far more secluded and far more inside my house than I really have been, not just because of COVID and fear of coronavirus, but also masking. I can't lip read anymore, right? A lot of the body cues that you might rely on in terms of body language and other cues to follow and understand what might be happening around you, that also has disappeared with social distancing. And so, you know, I have relied far more and had the privilege, I will acknowledge, to rely on food delivery or grocery delivery or ordering things online, both out of, you know, safety in terms of keeping myself safe from coronavirus, but also because I don't then have to deal with a cashier at the checkout line or ordering a meal. And it's really hard in the context of an environment and a context that we're in now to ask, as I have asked, for clear masks. That would be the ideal scenario for me, for all of us, everywhere where we are, for folks to be masked, but to have a clear panel where everybody who might be deaf or hard of hearing, or somebody who might have an auditory processing disability or a cognitive disability where you need to see somebody's face to fully understand what's being said, that would be the dream, but that's obviously not going to happen, you know, in every setting that I might be in. And so even just something as simple as going to the doctor's office, telehealth has been wonderful, but it's not always possible, and have had experiences over the last year where I've had to physically go into the doctor's office. That becomes an entire process of calling, requesting that they have a clear mask. It's a 50-50 whether they'll even know what a clear mask is, rescheduling your appointment, potentially even getting there and realizing they don't have a clear mask. And so those types of broader systemic barriers remain, and that's just one very small example from my lived experience, but just an example of how the larger systems around also really do influence one's comfort with asking for and disclosing your disability, but also asking for whatever accessibility needs one may have. In terms of the question on employers and how employers have responded to efforts and perspective, you know, I will just say that my organization is, we're celebrating a 40th anniversary next year. So NID has been around before the ADA was passed, and as an organization has really evolved. What we focused on in the last 10 to 15 years, we've very much focused on employment, and specifically on increasing the workforce participation of people with disabilities across the United States. And we have been incredibly fortunate that we have a deep bench of employer partners that are committed to disability inclusion. I think that the last 2 years have been especially interesting because with COVID, the impact of COVID, whether it's long haul COVID, individuals getting COVID themselves, caregiving, certainly in the US in the last year and a half, the focus on racial injustice, and also what employees are demanding of their employers and of their workplace has also just really shifted and broadened that awareness in terms of disability being as important of a part of an employee's day-to-day and of their experience than we really have seen in many years prior. So I'm incredibly energized and excited by that, and excited by what is to come in terms of what we can do in terms of changing behavior more broadly and in the workplace context in particular. And then I see a question here that says that I'm wondering what you can suggest for a group which would like to be more inclusive and welcoming to people with disabilities. What should we be doing? Could I ask a clarifying question? When saying group, is it a informal group? Is it a in the context of a professional context, or is this just in general any type of a group? Meditation group. Great question. I will. I think that certainly, just starting with the question of, we just want to understand if individuals have any access needs that we should be aware of that we can support with. That would be one way to start. I do think that I don't know to what extent this group is looking to grow or to expand membership, but as part of your outreach, just really making that request and question to folks of we are really able to modify or accommodate. I know meditation can be a bit hard for certain individuals. I know personally for myself, meditation is actually a challenge because a lot of it involves auditory engagement. And so oftentimes, in the last year and a half, it's been anxiety inducing for all of us, certainly. But one of the responses that I've often gotten from medical practitioners is, well, the Calm app is wonderful. And I'm like, I'm sure the Calm app is wonderful, but the Calm app is exclusively audio focused. And that's going to be incredibly stressful for me if I have to try to even piece together what one of the words are. And certainly you could read, but I don't quite know that it would do the same thing. So I think making those access needs, just asking, and then B, I think a little bit of creative thinking around what are other ways that somebody who might have auditory needs or auditory processing, or individuals who may have, there's just so many other different types of disabilities that might not quite work in a more traditional meditation context. What are other ways that they can be brought in and they can participate and partake that isn't more traditional? And when I say more traditional, I'm thinking closing your eyes and being still and listening and trying to silence your head. I will say that as somebody who is deaf, silence is my best friend. Actually, when I turn off my cochlear implants, it is complete silence for me. And so, I think that can actually personally sometimes be both a blessing and a hard thing sometimes, because there can be a lot of sound in silence. So just thinking a little creatively as well as what are some ways that you can engage others who might have different access needs to be able to fully participate in the meditation group.
Wow. Moeena, that's amazing. You've just given us so much content and so many answers, and it's been amazing. I don't know whether anyone has one last short question or comment they'd like to add before we wrap up. I'll just open maybe the floor for a moment. Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Kim.
Oh, I really appreciate what you're sharing, especially in the context of mindfulness and meditation, because what I've also found is if I don't ask for people's access needs in advance, sometimes I can't consider that the access needs will be competing. Like my mindfulness group has people with hearing loss, but also low vision, and their needs are so different. But if we don't know that in advance, we can't even consider how we might make it accessible for more people. So I just really appreciate that that's such a simple thing, is to just ask what people's access needs are before the event happens. It's just like has been such a point of importance for me. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And thank you, Moeena, for your wisdom and all the information that I know we will be chewing on and, really digesting for the next years. I think there's just so much to think about and to open our hearts to and shift our actions as a result.
And it,
Claire, did you want to say anything?
I just wanted to thank you too. And I think it's very inspiring, yet also discouraging to realize it's inspiring to see what we can do, but also discouraging that, again, as you said, you look forward to the day when this kind of thing is not necessary. So thanks for being a standard bearer. It's great to see you.
Well, thank you all. It was wonderful to be here, and thank you again, Claire and Annie and Rachel. And I will certainly look forward to sharing the additional resources. And if anyone has any questions, I'd be more than happy to follow up separately. So thank you all, and have a wonderful evening.
And this will be on the website. The webinar has been recorded and will eventually be published on the website.